Good morning on Steven's side of the world. We've got an interesting person today who is had 2 decades or more of enterprise security architecture modeling. Mr. Stephen Bradley, who has worked with IBM and Reuters in the past and several other companies as a cybersecurity designer. He holds the SABSA Practioner certificate. He is a founding member of the SABSA Institution. He's a founding member of the European security groups as well. He's quite active in those areas. He is an industry speaker and has published a few papers on security architecture modeling. So we will talk about Stephen's rich. He's got a master's in computer science from Southampton University in the UK, and we'll talk to him on his journey on what's taken him to venture into the space of cybersecurity and specifically cybersecurity modeling. What does that field hold, and what are the kind of knickknacks that you need to gather to be a good cybersecurity designer? Welcome, Stephen, to the series, and it'd be great to have your thoughts on that, on your journey. Please walk us through your journey over the years on how you ended up becoming a cybersecurity designer, modeler, and all of that.
Sure. Thank you, Kieran. I'm super pleased to be invited onto this series. You put me in illustrious company here. Okay. So my journey from outset to where I am now is, I think my background initially was a developer. Oh dear. The phone's ringing. Damn.
No problem. I think
no problem. So yeah, I started out initially as a software developer. I was initially working as you mentioned, at Reuters, which is a company that gave me two main, I think, starts into security. The first of which was that naturally, as a company that always recognized that their data was their crown jewels, and that they were piping it into highly secure establishments like stock exchanges and government ministries, that anything that the developers produced had to be secure before operations would accept it. Okay, so there was a culture of secure networking, and application security wasn't big at that time, but there was definitely this security culture, although I wasn't directly responsible for security myself.
Yeah.
The second part of it, it was a time when XML was emerging, and Reuters was lucky to be quite at the start of that game, at a time when if you wanted to learn XML, there were only maybe 5 books on the market that would teach you how to do it. And they were interested in converting all their rich financial data and news data models into this new technology. So I was working in the areas of the news ML that they were pioneering at the time, and a business markup language for reporting company share prices. Okay. Now the next thing that happened, of course, was the millennium bug. This was the late 90s, and I got involved in scanning code, looking for areas of software that seemed to be dealing with dates manipulation. And that got me sort of working in kind of the Perl programming language and looking at source code and trying to pick out anything that was dealing with leap years, right? So millennium bug out of the way, this idea of scanning code, of having this kind of this security culture that was sort of building up in my background, meant that when I later turned to consultancy, I moved to Belgium as a trailing spouse and applied for a new job, initially as a Java architect, but it was the security side of my CV that captured their interest. Okay. So pretty soon I was finding myself doing, ISO 27000 roadmaps for clients, a lot less technical, but a much broader sort of a business scope of looking at business risks through IT. And then after I'd done that for a few years, I came back to sort of the more technical side, started getting interested in the SABSA security architecture framework. did sort of like CIS type certifications, and after several years of doing sort of like architectural risk analysis, started thinking about how can this be industrialized, how is it automated, because it seemed like a very manual sort of like witch doctor incantation type of process. It was a case of calling an expert, get an opinion, but no two experts would ever give you exactly the same risk analysis.
Yeah, yeah.
And as you need to train people, as you work in a team, you're looking for this kind of like consistency of process. So when I first came across Archimate, things started to fit together somehow. You know, I could see that this was a nice way of documenting the systems that you were trying to analyze. There was no native security view in it. So having drawn these models of systems that were just still in the design phase and used them to analyze the security, the risks, controls, vulnerabilities, I then wanted to add the security analysis into the models, right? So this is where this idea came from. I've been working on this since about 2016.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just quite like your idea about overloading the aspects, the native aspects of the Archimate elements where there is no support and the interpretation could be hugely different when you apply that to a security world, wherein you say that there is a vulnerability, but there is no such thing as you derive from a vulnerability, but whereas a vulnerability supports a certain principle and it leads to certain other requirements and so on. So I think that's a good way to tweak the framework to meet your ends of what you wanted it to convey as a part of the security. So I think your frustration with not finding a modeling language that would help you to ease the pains of security architecture modeling, I think that's where your work perhaps would have started.
Yeah, it's very much like that, because bringing those two concepts together. I mean, I mentioned the SABSA framework, and for me, I was really taken in by what a thorough, well thought out, complete piece of theoretical work that was. I mean, almost every possible activity you come across in security has its place in the SABSA methodology. Okay, but SABSA by itself didn't seem to scale well. It seemed to be very expensive because you have all these artifacts that you need to keep in a consistent state, right? And then you look at the Archimate world where your enterprise architecture is all being documented from a single coherent model made up of, for which you view through several views and perspectives. But if you change the characteristics of an element in the underlying model, all the views reflect the latest change. And I was thinking, this is exactly what is kind of like holding SABSA back from being something that is only really commercially viable in large scale government critical projects. Whereas if you can make it lighter and with some tool support, like an Archimate, it becomes accessible to commercial projects. You can bring security Archimate benefits, but bringing modeling to SABSA helps SABSA take off.
Correct. Otherwise, it's like a huge white elephant that, as you said, it's got so many controls. It pretty much models an entire enterprise from a startup to a huge multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And then,
SABSA to me look perfect at a small scale, but as soon as you try to scale up, you end up with this document management nightmare of trying to keep 36 different artifacts.
Correct. And not maybe all the operational attributes are at play for a given enterprise.
Yeah, because it's very often a mixture of Word documents and Excel spreadsheets and Visios and PowerPoints and
Okay. So that's nice. And how much of all of this have you been? I know you for sure that you've been using this for solving the problem of control objectives, gathering security requirements, and risk management. What about illustrating threat modeling and showing indicators of compromise? There are a lot of threat modeling tools out there. So does this integrate with the tools, or this is more to get a picture of how the landscape currently looks, and then you could use it. You could directly integrate it with a threat modeling tool as
Yeah.
well.
Well, this again was another characteristic of security. I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago, that there were lots of ideas and tools and techniques for doing security analysis. You could create threat models, you could create I don't know, like privacy flow diagrams, but they were all distinct, disjoint, separate notations, right? And what I realized when I was doing the Archimate work is that this was a tool that was, if you could get an Archimate language established in an organization, the enterprise architects would be using it, the solution architects would be using it, the business process architects might be using it, the main architects would use it. Security architects were never, ever going to get a separate tool, right? There was only ever going to be one model.
Yeah. So
the official organizational model, and security architects would be expected to use it, not a host of old separate tools and applications, because synchronization again, So the key seemed to be to adapt Archimate to support the security viewpoint.
Yeah.
And then you would benefit from the models that the solution architects had created, and you would use that as the basis of your analysis, and you would feed that analysis back into the one central tool.
Okay, so what you're saying is using Archimate with SABSA provides you this consistent, uniform language and taxonomy to unify the people across the organization, so that they have one common language to talk about and relate to.
Right. So start from a position that you want to add security into SABSA. The next question that comes up is, well, what security views do I need? What do I want to express?
Correct.
And that's where SABSA is the most complete and well-defined reference of the artifacts that security practitioners need to show. So if I thought that if I could go through each of the sort of 36 cells of the SABSA matrix and show how those artifacts can be expressed in Archimate, I'd have a pretty complete model.
Okay.
Now, we talk about standardizing the language. That's about selection of the properties that you need for the existing elements. Which new concepts do we have to introduce to support security? Which new relationships? Right. So basically, anything that as a human analyst you would want to know about a model to do a cognitive assessment, you need to have a place to put that information in the model. Okay. And then you have a chance of it becoming, if you can standardize that, you can build tools and scripts that help you in the analysis. Okay. Right. So there's a couple of small steps there. SABSA provides the completeness. Correct. The overlay is something that we try and standardize so that we can build upon it.
Sure. I think the viewpoints, as you said, is substantiated or can be leveraged using the Archimate notations. But SABSA tells you the completeness in terms of covering the entire ground in terms of security landscape.
Correct. Yeah. So, and by obviously by fitting it into the Archimate modeling language, you automatically benefit from all the tool support that's out there. It's not like we have to modify existing tools to support security. Okay, it's not a perfect design, but we can kind of like what I call like a shoehorn fit at the times. You can squeeze and bend or shape the Archimate language to support what the security is trying to express.
Okay. So one question, Stephen, before you chanced upon this, what do you think the previous world was trying to use? So like before the advent of SABSA with Archimate, how do you think people were trying to do that? They were trying to use some boxes and arrows, or was it UML and some PowerPoint stuff? So there was no standardization there.
Yeah, my favorite technique prior to this was a technique called architectural risk analysis that was popularized by one of my favorite gurus, Gary McGraw, in his digital building security in series. Okay. And he would draw these. I mean, maybe I can show you one if I can share the screen?
I'll make you the presenter. Just give me a minute.
Okay, because I have one here. If I, okay, make me the presenter. I'll show you a typical diagram that we used to have.
So you are the presenter now.
Okay. So if I bring that on and do you see that?
Not yet. I think you haven't shared the screen.
Okay. Let me step back a second. I share the screen.
Yeah, I can see now.
Right. So this is where I started. This diagram on the right is a typical diagram from architectural risk analysis. Basically, what you have is kind of like a block or a system diagram of the various parts of your target system.
Okay.
You mark down the applications, the servers, the users, the data, the network components you'll see in there. And what this technique did is say, use the little gold boxes to identify where your assets are. Then use the little red devils to show where your malicious actors are situated.
Yeah, the devilish looking ones.
And then, work out the path between the malicious actor and the asset and place little green boxes to show where your controls are being placed.
Okay. So this was initially Gary, you said
Gary McGraw's
his notations.
I think this diagram comes from one of Gary's papers. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, this is the technique I was following. As I said, I was
Perfect. I get it. Yeah.
His work.
Yeah.
But of course, if you look at this diagram more closely, there's no formal notation there. It's a mixture of applications, data, infrastructure components, network protocols. It's not. There's no business view of this at all. You can't see, the impact of these applications on business processes.
Yeah.
Or like requirements that come from legislation or from regulations.
Yeah.
It's basically a fairly informal Visio type of block diagram, but it's good for starting a conversation with the solution architects. If you can get this diagram drawn, sorry, you can do a fairly complete job of the vectors that take place between the attacker and the asset, and you can mark where your controls need to be. And in the absence of any other documentation, this is as good as anything. But it's for a human dialogue or a discussion. It's certainly not machine readable. And all architectural layers are merged into one diagram. Yeah.
You cannot, for instance, export this to another tool or things like that.
No. So it's a discussion piece. It's something that you can put in. You can discuss with your stakeholders. You can put this diagram in your final report. It's a communication tool, but it's not got the formality or the notation, the meanings, the semantics of what do the colors mean? Is it consistent? I mean, apart from the red, green, and gold boxes, is there a difference between a network component gateway and a web server and a browser? Well, maybe not. It's just a blue box.
Yeah.
So when I discovered Archimate, I could say, oh well, yeah, this is a natural advance on that because it's got that enterprise architecture layering, and it's got a formal notation and an underlying XML model.
It connects the business world and the IT world together and makes the diagram a whole lot richer in terms of how does it flow in terms of regulatory needs, business needs, and not just, as you said, the solution architect needs. It ties that whole perspective, I think. Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll switch off my sharing now, and we can take the conversation forward.
Yeah. So Stephen, one more thing is, what do you see are the trends in terms of modeling these days, and where is modeling really going to? Because there's always this complaint about the fact that, okay, once you model it to mimic a real world system, yes, it does that job, but then keeping them updated in sync with the real models out there, how does that happen? Like, how do you actually keep them step by step updated? Is that realistic, or that shouldn't even be the goal of modeling? You model it to figure out what's really happening. The other one could be a
Yeah.
digital twin kind of a scenario, wherein it's more
Mm.
real time and all that. But in the security world, where do you think things are actually going?
Okay. Well, from where I sit in Benelux, I think the digitalization push and even the pandemic has aroused a lot of interest in doing proper enterprise architecture, right? Previously, enterprise architecture was kind of like an informal set of like diagrams and documents and an intranet service full of documents of various vintages that maybe were accurate at the time they were written, maybe they weren't, maybe they've not been updated. But as we want to change faster, as the need for agility has grown, then I think organizations are very conscious now that they need to get a better grip of their enterprise architecture documentations. And I think enterprise architecture tools are, well, let's say this, doing enterprise architecture without enterprise architecture tools is now like writing documents without a word processor.
Okay.
Right? To do any kind of enterprise architecture properly, you need a tool. Enterprise architecture teams are forming, they're establishing their practices. And really, I think the Archimate language is the natural first place to turn, right? So I'm seeing a big uptick in interest in enterprise architecture tools. Normally, the domain model can be shared out between the business verticals, or it can be done in layers, or like the networks, the applications, the business processes. But of course, the security perspective is a cross-cutting dimension. It touches everything. It's not a security domain that you can separate. And yet the Archimate modeling language doesn't really support security, at least as a first-class citizen, like the other areas are, right?
Yeah.
And I've talked to them about this, and they said, yes, I know. The design manifesto of Archimate says it is for the many, not the few, right? And they mean the many architects, but not the few. And they see the security dimension, I think, in terms of that manifesto as being too niche. It would be a layer that not too many other architects would use. It's too specialist.
Okay.
But I'd say, yes, I can see that's true from the point of view of your manifesto, but at the same hand, the security view is too essential to leave out, even if not everyone is using it.
Okay? Yes. Correct.
So we're in discussion. At the moment, there's a call for ideas and suggestions for the next minor release of Archimate. So I've put some ideas forward of how we can creep closer to something that makes the architect's world a little easier without a wholesale redesign. But
correct.
Yeah, but
I did read about the same thing in Gerben Veda's book Mastering Archimate, where he talks about how to use this for scenarios which are out of the way, the edge cases, wherein you can you can model, overload the elements. You can, when in doubt, always use the stereotype notation and give it extra meaning and things like that.
But I'm thinking there must be hundreds of organizations across the world all trying to figure that out themselves in isolation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm pleased to have the backing of the SABSA Institute in this. Is I think if the SABSA architectural practitioners can propose something towards the open group and say, okay, this is not part of your core standard, but as security practitioners, this is what we think is a reasonable set to a security overlay for Archimate. So not a non-core overlay, something that's contributed by the community that you can add in and adopt. And if you can get that kind of sort of like buy-in and support from the large institutions, then maybe even the tool vendors will make it easier to apply these properties. Because properties at the moment in Archimate don't have an awful lot of support in terms of, there's not much standardization. They're actually very scarcely utilized in the standard specification.
Correct. I think it still doesn't. Sorry, I think it still doesn't mimic a real world, right? A dynamic real world in terms of okay, what is this? It kind of it's good to model a static picture of it, but the values keep changing. That's not what it was intended for in the first place. So that could be a problem. Yeah, but I think SABSA was already talking to, sorry, the open group was already talking to SABSA because they've brought that layer into TOGAF 9.2, wherein SABSA and TOGAF, they handshake each other. And, they give each other the credit for what they're good at. TOGAF for the enterprise architecture world of it, and SABSA for the security requirements gathering perspective and defining the entire.
It goes back a lot further than that. I think SABSA first proposed a white paper to show how SABSA could be overlaid onto TOGAF. That back in 2011, I think, was the white paper.
The history is quite old, but recently they formalized it and baked it into the framework in TOGAF 9.2. They have a specific reference of enterprise security architecture requirements, and they introduced the SABSA risk part of the security, the concept of positive and negative risk, all of that sort of stuff.
That's right.
Into that. So what would be typically the the learning curve for anybody involved in especially there are doubts like you use the standard Archimate framework and then try to model that to the SABSA world. Obviously there are challenges, the meanings are very different. So when in doubt, what's your recommendation? Use something called association notation or triggering kind of a thing, or simply this uses that. The use by was quite popular in Archimate. Now there's no use by. What's your recommendation on that?
This obviously you take it on a case-by-case basis, but if people would like to learn more, there's my white paper on this is published through the SABSA Institute website. So you
I'll
can
be sharing a
go
link of that
and download it. In fact, I've got a slide I can kind of like illustrate
please
what the overlay is if you
you are already the presenter. You are the presenter. Yeah, you can share your screen.
All right, then let's go on to this one again and share that. So do you see the slide now?
Yes. The SABSA.
So this is like four quadrants. The top row is kind of theory. And we've said before that the SABSA theory is aligned with the TOGAF theory through the 2011 white paper and the 9.2 series guide. If you descend from the theory to practical application of these enterprise architecture frameworks, you see that on the right-hand side, TOGAF is obviously naturally aligned to Archimate because of it's coming from the same stable, the same open group. But for the security artifacts from SABSA, I say what you have is this collection of isolated documents, right, that you have to keep in sync. So what I've basically done with the security overlay is to sort of replace that with a set of properties and security and stereotypes that are security relevant for each of the existing elements. Right, so for every Archimate element, we say what we need to know about that element to be able to secure it properly, or what contribution that element can make to security. And then we've got this missing gap here of security concepts. So here I'm talking about things like that sit between the business layer and the application. So we're talking about principles, about trust, about accounts, about permissions, about the security business, the SABSA business attributes themselves. How do we represent those in the Archimate? So the Archimate security overlay on the left is created to be out of the extension mechanisms that naturally are designed into Archimate. And what we then do is obviously merge the overlay into the standard Archimate model to give you now a security enhanced view of your Archimate diagrams.
Okay.
And to, as I say, to find out more about this, there's the white paper on the SABSA Institute website, which I've got there.
Okay, one small question on this, Steve. Actually,
yeah.
The security part, don't you think there's a bit of that lying inside the business layer also? So there's a bit of security inside the business layer.
Sorry, security is across all layers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but now it looks like the security is below the business layer in this representation.
What I'm talking, yeah, okay, so I could make that clear. What that layer is are the security concepts that say that sit between the business layer and the logical layer. So in the business layer, you have a person, but in the security layer, you have to make that person a principal or a subject.
Okay, assign him a role. Yeah, you have to assign him a role or something like that.
Yeah, so in the business world, you have a role, but in the security world, you have a set of privileges, some access rights. Okay, so they're kind of tied to the role, but you're not quite in the application layer yet. This is a security administrative process that gives you your account, your entitlements. So the ability to authenticate and to have access control. So so for example, in the business information, the kind of properties that we would add to secure something in the business in the business layer, obviously for business information, we want to know what's the availability, the confidentiality, the integrity, who's the owner, maybe what's the retention period, does it contain personal data or not? If we know that, then obviously we can perform security analysis, either manually as a human analyst, or increasingly through machine intelligence, right? Which is the next place that's kind of like this model is going. Okay, so I'll stop the share there.
Yeah.
But hopefully that illustrates, how this overlay fits together with the main model.
Yeah, fine. So what do you think? So basically, when you said that artifacts part, which was all scattered into different tools like Visio, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, so all of that could currently be served by Archi, the tool, or any Archimate compliant tool could kind of concretize that aspect and put all of it into one place.
Yeah, you replace all those separate artifacts with one, not only a coherent security model, but you've built security into the enterprise architecture model. So you don't have a separate security model now from the real system that the rest of the organization is maintaining. Okay. It becomes part of the same single source of truth.
Okay. How does one read all these documents? Because if you open the Archimate tool, there would be a set of views which are there one after the other. And how do you make sense of the flow? So would it be like take it all into a document and then create the flow yourself to give you the overall big picture of how to represent the security? Probably this is just a integration question, or how do you really use it in practice? But what are your thoughts on how do you make that happen? Because you have a set of scattered diagrams now, but you need to make sense of the entire enterprise security landscape. So you probably
well, this is obviously not new for enterprise architecture tools. Yeah. This is what they're designed to do. Correct. The underlying target system in most organizations is simply too complex for everyone to understand all of it, right? So the beauty of Archimate is that you create a series of views that are tailored to each specific stakeholder, but are all part of the same underlying model derived. So that if each stakeholder looks at their view of the system and confirms that it's accurately represents their understanding of what the system is, what it does, what it needs to do, then collectively, and people will review that. People will review half a dozen diagrams.
Yeah.
They won't review an 80-page document more than the first time. Okay.
Correct.
So, inherently by using modeling and diagrams, you're increasing the quality of your documentation. It's easier to maintain up to date. You can do it more frequently, and yet every change that you make is on the single underlying model and is reflected everywhere. Now, coming back to your question, when it comes to the security, there are two types of activity that we need to do. We can take the diagrams that have already been created by the business modelers or the solution architects, and we can make sure that we can add or that the security properties of the overlay are captured in those models, so that we understand not just the data flows and the connectivity, but the significance, what it means in terms of value or risk to the organization.
Yeah.
So I'm saying security architects will annotate existing diagrams, and then they will create new diagrams of their own. So, for
Absolutely.
example, a diagram that we would create for a particular security purposes, you're aware of like the open fair risk assessment.
The risk assessment framework.
It's like
Absolutely.
a new sort of quantitative-based risk assessment methodology that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, if I can share again, I will show you
Sure.
how that looks in Archimate, because we've got a model of that here. Just a second while I bring the thing up. I'll show you an open fair example. Let me share the screen. Here we go. Here it comes. Let me just open this up, or click the tab. Right. You see this screen here? Yeah. So if I can. Yeah.
I think the previous view was better, maybe because oh yeah. Okay.
Is that okay? Is that we see the whole picture now?
Yeah, this is better. This is better.
So if you, for anyone unfamiliar with the open fair taxonomy, what we basically say is we try and estimate the risk of a certain scenario happening.
Okay.
And because estimating the risk can be quite difficult, this methodology says, well, let's break it down. Let's try and estimate the composite factors, and maybe by doing that.
Yeah, I think before that, Stephen, if you can give a background about this scenario, because what is the business use case? I think that'll make it very rich.
Okay, so let's see. This is a piece of work that we did with the Open Group, the Open Fair team.
Yeah.
So as well as publishing documents on the Open Fair methodology and the taxonomy, they've given an example of a use case to demonstrate how the situation is applied.
Right.
And then in this particular example, we have an example of an executive in the HR department that is in the habit of keeping their username password stuck to their monitor on a sticky note.
Yeah.
Right. An obvious security risk.
Yeah.
So by trying to convert this this example, which is published as a document, into an Archimate model, we first of all capture this scenario. So we've got the HR executive as an actor that's involved in the function of HR management, the HR division, And in that role, of course, they have access to a large amount, reading here, of employee information. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when that in the course of performing their duties, they're logging on to the organization's network domain. They get access to the data equivalent of that information. They have to authenticate, which is one of the security concepts that we've introduced in the overlay. And that authentication obviously needs credentials, right? And in this case, that concept or that representation of credentials is realized by a physical material. It's a sticky note stuck to the monitor, right?
Yeah,
That attachment.
yeah.
So that's the scenario. We're then asked to, in this example, to work out what is the risk of that password being used to compromise the system by a variety of threat actors. And the threat actors they ask you to look at, well, okay, they mentioned that there could be several threat actors that would have access to that physical space where the sticky note is written, including the cleaning crew, other members of the HR department, visitors to the office, job applicants might get a glimpse of it, technical support staff that come around occasionally and scan the barcodes for an asset inventory check, right? Now, what the example does is just asks you to concentrate on the cleaning crew, right?
So I think one more crazy edge scenario that I can think of is if the sticky note peels off when the fans are on or whatever it is after it dries up for some time. Maybe it's available to the entire organization. It's available to the entire organization. So that could be another.
Right, and the real users logged out, of course. Huh?
Yeah, so it could be pretty much anybody in the organization.
Right.
Yes, perfect, no problem. Please go ahead.
So yeah, so from that we concentrate on the cleaning crew because in open fair, every analysis is done on a specific scenario. So it's not just a case of we're analyzing here credential misuse. It's credential misuse through this particular sticky note on this particular monitor by this particular community of people that may be a possible threat. Okay, and we have to assess the capabilities and competences of the cleaning crew. They'll be different from those of the HR staff, different from those of the technical support staff, you can imagine, as is the frequency with which that crew might have access to the monitor. Are the offices cleaned every night or once a week? Job applicants might be coming through, I don't know, once a month. Yeah. You know, all these scenarios have got different characteristics. And that is why when we come to the
What do you mean by cleaner? Sorry, Steve, on the previous diagram, what do you mean when you say cleaner crew threat competence? So basically, is he able to read and write, or is he able to read English, or which is the note, that kind of stuff?
Right. So what is the average IT competence of someone in the cleaning crew?
Okay. That way.
Right.
Okay.
Are they going to inject malware? Are they going to
intelligent enough to exploit the threat and so on, basically.
Yeah, and what's their motivation?
Okay.
What do they think they will achieve? Is there sufficient deterrent for them to understand the value of the assets that they might get access to? What would they use that information for? Okay, so it's motivations, drivers, competencies, any equipment needed, any planning and preparation. Are they stealing information to order? All these type of considerations you get built into the risk factor. Okay. But in the end, let's say what we do is, in this particular example, is we've built this this risk taxonomy in a single diagram that shows, you know, the risk at the top level tree, how it's broken down into threat event frequency by expected loss magnitude. The threat event frequency is, the loss event frequency is built against the loss event frequency. So how often does the threat arise against the vulnerability? How often is the threat successful? Okay.
Yeah.
And each of these factors is kind of like broken down in the end to fundamental estimates of, what's the potential of the cleaning crew to pose a threat, right? And how does that compare to the resistance strength of a password or credentials in plain sight? Now,
Okay.
obviously, passwords in plain sight is highly exposed. You have here that the resistance is very low.
Okay.
So what it's saying is even someone with moderate technical skills would be able to recognize that the information on that sticky note is a username and password. They would know what it was for. They might understand that it's private information they shouldn't really have. They might be curious to see what access they can get and what's behind it, or what mischief they might create. Okay. And eventually, what we can do in this diagram is say, well, that combination of a very low resistance with a moderate
but how do you interpret
threat
that as,
capability.
sorry, Stephen, how do you interpret that as very low resistance on part of the system? Because as you said, everything is exposed out there. So I was thinking the low, very high, medium is the kind of risk that's there across the board, right? Or is it from the perspective of
Yeah.
the...
So in this example, the organization has a set of scales and tables that are defined organization-wide, for example. So a threat capability, if I just navigate the model, it says, the threat capability is kind of like very high when the top 2% of people can do it, can pose that threat. So if you're in the top 2% of experienced, capable, knowledgeable people, you can rate that capability as high. What we've said here is it's moderate in the example. So it's average skill. So somewhere between the bottom 16% and the top 16%.
Okay.
So that includes, cleaners can be university students on summer vacation jobs, right? They can then...
This is not from that perspective that, if the guy hacks into the system, obviously, doesn't matter what his skills are, the risk is alarmingly large. So it's not from that perspective.
Yeah.
I get it.
So when you try and combine that threat capability with the low resistance strength, you get this chart. Okay.
Correct.
Your threat capability is medium. Your resistance strength of a password in plain sight is very low.
Okay.
Therefore, your vulnerability rating is very high.
Okay.
See that?
Yeah.
So this is all sort of like navigated in the model, and these values basically ripple up and combine until you end up with your overall risk rating for that particular scenario.
Correct.
Right. Now, obviously, that low risk is just the risk of this password misuse by the cleaning crew.
Okay.
We create a separate diagram for the visitors, for the HR staff, for the
employees,
job interviewees, and then you could aggregate those risks into a total risk, right? Or you then add a control that says, okay, we're going to have a policy about clean desktops. We're going to have some sanctions against people that don't adhere to that policy. And we're going to try and eliminate this bad habit of sticky note passwords from the entire organization. And then that implement that control, and you estimate how effective it is. And again, all these calculations ripple up. So you can imagine using this in a scenario, for example, where you've got a limited budget or a limited amount of time. You're trying to determine which controls to implement to give you the best cost effectiveness or to reduce the worst of your perceived risks. And you could use a model like this to play around just to see what you can do in that time frame, what your best course of action is to minimize the overall loss expectancies or the overall risks.
Okay, so you can tie this to ISO 27001 control objectives pretty much, right? So you could
Yeah, well,
potentially do that.
ISO 27001 isn't prescriptive about how you do your
Yeah, it's very detailed, as you said. It's an
methodology.
ocean out there. But as an organization, you might be interested only in a subset of some controls for which you
Yeah,
could model and be ready.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So as I say, I'll stop the share there. We can go back to chatting.